Good morning, everybody. I'm Douglas Turkington, and I'm a psychiatrist from Newcastle in the United Kingdom. And it's a great pleasure to deliver this workshop today to family members in Marin County. The subject is cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT, informed caring for families who have a loved one with schizophrenia or another psychotic disorder. And this workshop is supported by a grant from the Marin County Board of Supervisors. So I'm a psychiatrist, and I've worked in the field of cognitive behavioural therapy and schizophrenia for the last 30 years. And for about the last 10 years, I've been very interested in working with family members in order that they can become active ingredients in the recovery of their loved one. So let's have a look at the overview of this workshop. First of all, I'm going to look at the crucial area of communication. And this really is the foundation stone of building recovery. And I'm going to talk about the various elements of communication within the household. And I'm going to introduce the ideas of a befriending approach, which has an evidence base as an easy to learn communication modality which aids recovery. And that will be our first video presentation. There will then be an exercise and a question and answer. And then we move on to that crucial area which families find so difficult. What do we do when the loved one just doesn't want our help and doesn't want to interact with us because they don't have insight into the fact that they have mental health problems? We're then going to work into the issue of how can we, within the family environment, more effectively care for our loved ones when they are hearing or seeing things that we can't see, or when they have a deeply rooted belief which we don't quite see the evidence for. So how can we help with hallucinatory experiences and delusions? Our next video is about negative symptoms. That is when there's no motivation there and when there's very little in the way of emotion to be seen. What can we actually do to help care better for our loved one with negative symptoms? And the last video presentation of the day will be about the crucial area of coping strategies. How can we cope better, and can we help our loved ones cope better? So that's the plan for today's workshop. So working through the day, Kelly will give us an introduction. We'll then go into session one, and thereafter question and answer breakout groups to do a bit of work around the key topics of each video presentation. And on through the day with a combination of video presentations, exercise, and question and answer through to the close at the end of the day. So I think at this point, before we get into the subjects in detail, let's just do a brief period of reflection, because schizophrenia and psychosis, I think it's fair to say every single presentation is a bit different from every other one. And so, I mean, there are common themes within the issues that family members have to try and adapt to care for, but everyone's got their own particular problems and targets. So what I would like you to do at this point is maybe write down 2 to 3 key goals for today's workshop. Hopefully this will arise within the topics of each video session. And if not, then please make sure that it comes up in the question and answer session. And we hope your goals will be achieved in due course. Here we have a goalkeeper making a save, but we want the goal to actually be on target and achieved today and worked towards in future. So this is our first session. We're talking about, first of all, what is actually happening at home in terms of the current communication style. So we want to get a real perspective on that. It may not need to change. It may be pretty good, but all of us have a tendency to get stuck in particular communication styles, which could perhaps be slightly adapted. We're going to mention the contribution of Amador and the LEAP program, which has been really processed and implemented by NAMI. And this is a great starting point in terms of improving communication style. And I'm hoping that what we'll learn today will build upon the key components of the LEAP program. I'm then going to talk a bit about the crucial component of reducing high levels of expressed emotion. This is yet another key factor of not only recovery, but preventing relapse. Then about neutrality, emotional neutrality. What is that like? What would that feel like in the household? I'm then going to talk about befriending as this easy to learn communication style, which we know is very useful for many types of psychosis, in particular people with delusions, but also useful for negative symptoms and depression. Then I'm going to talk about how can we use talking to care for our loved ones a bit better. And this is starting to get into some of the ideas of cognitive behavioral therapy, which we know are safe and we know can aid communication and gradually lead into a recovery trajectory. Now, this session will end with the crucial subject of culture and psychosis. So I hope this first session is going to be interesting for everyone. So first of all, let's have a think. We're all in our families. Let's have a think about our own father or mother so we can get a feel for this idea of perspective on family communication, and think about 4 keywords and an image to describe their communication style. So, bit of personal disclosure here. In 1980, I was in my early 20s, and I'm thinking about the emotional environment within my home at that time. So we have a Scottish father at that time, and some key words for him would be he was a proud man, and he was a man that kept secrets. He was a bit stigmatized. Um, he was very generous, and he was really good fun. And I think those words best sum up the way my dad was at that time. And my image that came to me when I was thinking about my father at that time was of a clam. So he was tremendous fun when things were going well. But if there was anything painful or shameful going on, he would just stop talking about it. He would not go there. So that was my dad's sort of style. And if we talk about the mood mug, what was in the mug in terms of my communication with my dad and his communication with me, there was lots of pride, 40%. There was a bit of shame, 20%. There was kindness, 20%, and a sense of humor, 20%. That is the way he interacted with me. And as the younger person in the household, that was the tone of the interaction. On the other hand, my mother was she was extremely busy, doing lots of things all the time, very energetic, very kind, very happy, mostly able to talk about anything that went wrong, really. But between my father and mother, there was a dominance thing. The father was the more dominant. That was crystal clear. And there was a bit of schism in that things that my father didn't want spoken about would not be spoken about. So, in terms of me growing up in that environment, if I had started to hallucinate, if I'd got a bit paranoid, and if I'd lost insight, that family environment would have been very difficult. My mother would have done too much for me. My dad wouldn't have spoken about anything. And I think in that environment, I would have been stuck. I don't know, but that's how it looks looking on, that would not have been a family that would easily have dealt with a son developing a psychosis. Now, at this point, it must be said, there are no super families out there that can easily deal with a loved one developing this illness. All there are normal families and normal people doing the very best they know how to, doing the best they can. But thinking about that situation, the very least the family would have needed was family support. The kind of thing that might come through NAMI, that might come through a LEAP type intervention. They absolutely would have needed that at that time. And I think they would have accepted it if had it been offered. Of course, at that time, it didn't exist and wouldn't have been offered. So thinking about what would your loved one say about you, this is something we just don't know. Which 4 keywords would they choose about your communication style? And would they have an image? So I had the 4 keywords of the pride and the shame and the image of the clam. What would your loved ones say about you? I mean, this is an exercise you could do at home at some point, and it might be very, very interesting. And which emotion would they say dominates the household communication style? Do we really have insight into how we come across in communication? So I thought I would try to find this out. And I asked my PhD student, who is also a friend of mine, and I've been supervising her work for about 10 years. So I said, I want the honest truth of this. How do I come across, and what kind of emotions are generated when I come across in the way that I typically do. And I said, I want the truth. I don't want you to pull your punches here. I want to know the facts of it. So this is what I was told. You come across as being too ambitious. For example, the sky's the limit, and you really need to be getting there. And you're just too positive. You're always expecting everything to be successful. You also seem to overdo it, and you come across as being slightly chaotic. And you're also a people pleaser. Why don't you just stick to your own views? So it wasn't at all what I expected. And it looks to me like that communication style needs work on it. It needs to be improved. That is problematic. It looks to me like I wouldn't actually be a very good carer if I had a loved one who had hallucinations or paranoia or had lost insight. So maybe we all need some kind of family therapy type input to try and get communication right. What did my PhD student say about the moods that they detected in the interaction? Well, they said it was a mixture. They felt energized by my ambition and positivity. They felt contained, but there was anxiety there in case the targets weren't being hit. And there was sadness if there were any perceived failures. So maybe I'm not that easy a supervisor, and maybe not that, I wouldn't be that great of a carer either. This would be described as a high expressed emotion style. Now, this would be a bad style for a loved one with an early psychosis. It would not help them. So I would need to change my style, and then we would communicate better and take the pressure off and have less expressed emotion going on so that we could start to slowly move forwards. So that was the question, is what is the main emotional tone? And thinking back to within my own family background, I would have to actually say, if I was going to circle any of these, it would have been shame, because that was the dominant issue. There always had to be this front put on that everything was okay. And if anything wasn't, there was this undercurrent of shame. And of course, shame's quite a destructive emotion in many different ways. But you could be circling any one of these as the kind of main emotional tone in the home. Now, it's wonderful, obviously, if you're circling happy or joyful or content. That is fantastic. But most families usually aren't circling these. Content would be great, but there's often a bit of sadness, a bit of tension, a bit of frustration there. I mean, maybe you can have a chat afterwards and think about which one of these you would be circling. Obviously, lots of houses are conflicted about certain subjects and between certain people in the family. And conflict is, again, negative in terms of recovery. So it can be a real eye-opener. I think the first thing to say is that people with psychosis, they may well be feeling really paranoid and anxious. They may well have very little insight into that, but they are highly sensitive to what the emotional tone is and what the type of communication is that's going on. So they're very, very alert to that. And that is why communication is such a key issue in facilitating recovery. So, is the communication style appropriate in terms of helping this recovery? Is the emotional tone set right, or does this need to be changed? And anyway, it's been that way for such a long time. How on earth can we begin to change something like that? Well, maybe it's time. Maybe it is time for that fresh start to happen. Now, obviously, I've got to mention Amador's work here because it is working at the heart of communication. And CBT informed caring hopefully builds something on to the LEAP training, which some of you will already have had. So LEAP puts down these 4 pillars of communication. Listen, that's a great starting point. Empathize, agree with what you can agree, and partner towards progress. So we're wanting to build on the LEAP program. What is befriending? Well, befriending has a proven evidence base in treating depression, treating schizophrenia, and in particular, treating delusions and negative symptoms. So this is something that should be easy to learn. How do you befriend somebody? Well, some people are naturals. They can walk up to somebody in the shopping mall, have an opening gambit of discussion, and pretty soon there is a pleasant social interaction happening. Now, the evidence seems to show that that type of social interaction is beneficial in mental disorders. So it means having short periods of befriending time put aside for those kind of brief periods of social interaction. Befriending doesn't have an agenda. So if you go into the hairdressers or the barbers, they are expert befrienders. So you'll be sitting there getting your hair done, and the barber says to you, have you got any holidays coming up? Have you any vacations? And you'll say, oh yes, I've got a holiday in Spain booked. And he'll say, oh, I was in Spain a couple of years back. And with that opening statement, you're straight into this kind of pleasant social interaction. And of course, you go home after that, you've got your new haircut, and you've also had a pleasant social interaction, and you feel good about yourself. Probably due to a combination of both of them, the hairstyle and the little pulse of befriending. So befriending doesn't have an agenda. You're not trying to achieve anything except have that period of time together. Now, it must be said, you probably have to schedule these times because they often don't happen in normal family interactions, that you have these little befriending times. An awful lot of families are focused on just getting through the day and meal times maybe, but maybe there's not much befriending time there. So we could approach the loved one in this different way of just trying to befriend them. Now, they may well start talking about a psychotic theme. They might appear to be hallucinating. They might talk about a delusional belief. And we're not going to confront or collude with the psychotic component. In befriending, you're accepting the person and accepting that they have a right to that belief that they hold and a right to hear things we don't hear. So we're befriending the person through the psychosis. We're not going to get sidetracked into talking about the delusion. We're going to take them out of the delusion. We're going to be talking about other aspects of life. So how are we going to do this? Well, we mentioned the hairdresser or the barber would always have an opening statement, an opening gambit that allows you to enter the communication. And you could use any of the classical ones. Oh, were you watching the sports on the television last night? Did you see that interesting soccer game? Or what do you think of the weather today? It's really lovely, isn't it? It's a lovely blue sky and an autumnal sort of day. I like these sorts of days. What do you think about this time of year? That these are just classical, easy starters to a communication. Now, obviously, your loved one with psychosis may well be puzzled and think, my dad, he has never spoken about the weather before. This is strange. So it might seem a bit odd at first, but if we persevere in this way, that very befriending session can lead on to other things. So it's as if you take all the pressure off and go back to the befriending approach. So personal disclosure is a good starting point. What do I think about the weather? Oh, it's freezing today, isn't it? Very cold. What sports am I interested in? What are my hobbies? Start there and see what the loved one says about them. Befriending is often focused on the present or in the past. So befriending will go back into happy times that we've had together. So if you say, I've got a trip planned, I'm going to go to a local historical city. Do you remember the time that we went and visited a castle when you were a child? That was fantastic, wasn't it? And you can go back to that time and take them out of their delusion for a bit to talk about that time where the family was together and one of their friends was there and it was a happy time. And you can fill out the details of that memory. So befriending will talk about present tense things and go back into the past to access pleasant emotions. And we're going to, befriending stays out of the future because sometimes the future looks pressured and a bit scary. We're going to use a bit of humor. I mean, many of my patients will remember a joke we once shared, a laugh we once had together, rather than the many hours of discussion about medication, etc. So humor is very useful in befriending. Can we think about old hobbies? And again, personal disclosure, I've recently taken up bird watching again. It's absolutely fascinating, all the different birds you can see. Remember, we once used to do that together. I mean, we can see some birds out the window here. I wonder what types they are. Could we reactivate some old hobby and do that together? Now, a flow pastime is a very useful type of hobby as it takes up a lot of your concentration and you kind of lose yourself in the activity. So a number of our loved ones may be used to play a musical instrument. Certainly something like that, it would be described as a flow activity. And befriending doesn't have targets. It is an end in itself. So I've seen so many family members who have recognized the communication issues in the household, and I've switched to brief pulses of befriending, and this has allowed communication to improve and move towards the beginnings of recovery. Now, one question which must be raised here is, do we befriend ourselves? Am I a friend to myself, or am I actually a bully to myself? Now, we can find this out. We can find this out by catching our automatic thoughts. Now, that this is the heart of CBT. You try and catch those brief phrases and words that pass just below the surface of the mind. For example, if I make a mistake in my work and I then notice it and say, that shouldn't have been done that way, I'm going to have to go back to the start and do it again. I might feel frustrated. What are the thoughts going through the mind? Can you catch them? It might be, you're a stupid fool. You should not have done that. Or might it be, anyone can make mistakes. I've been under a lot of pressure. Hey, I'm working hard. I'm doing my best. The odd mistake's okay. Now, if the thoughts are the former ones, you're a stupid fool, you shouldn't have done that, then you're not befriending yourself. That is a bullying type of inner world. And it tends to lead to sadness and anger and anxiety. But the second set of thoughts I mentioned there, hey, anyone can make a mistake. I've been working hard. That is befriending the self. So, are our thoughts gentle and self-nurturing or critical and demanding? The best time to capture these is when you have a shift in mood. Then you can normally catch these thoughts. Can you change it? Can you befriend yourself? If you are befriending yourself, that is good, because that will help the communication style at home with your loved one. If you are a bit more critical of yourself, I wonder if we can change that. Could we use the rational responses, which I've just mentioned? Anyone can make a mistake. I've been working hard. Maybe I'll go and get myself a cup of coffee and take it easy for a bit and then return to my work. Can we use those kind of thoughts to befriend ourselves? One thing that can work is if you get a picture, an old family picture of yourself as a child, and have a look at that child and think positive thoughts towards them. Think about nurturing that child. Think about where they've been and where they've got to. Think about the things that they've come through, the things that they've achieved. You could come up with some nurturing thoughts towards that child, because that child is you. And those thoughts can still be applied. Could you write a letter to yourself in this positive emotional tone? Now, these are all kind of CBT, informed caring type exercises. I'm not saying do them all. Just use one or two that are attractive to you, you think might be interesting. Anything that we do in terms of this befriending the self or writing a letter, we need to do a bit of practice with it. If we just do it as a one-off, it won't work. CBT informed caring needs practice, okay? So any of this stuff you're doing, practice it. For example, put those self-nurturing thoughts to yourself, record it on the audio on your cell phone, and listen to it once a day. If we practice these techniques, we can befriend ourselves And maybe that might cause a change in the home communication environment. Your loved one might detect that change in you. So, what is expressed emotion? Well, we've hinted at this earlier. There is very strong evidence that a neutral home emotional environment is protective against relapse and facilitative of recovery. Now, there's two elements of expressed emotion. The first one is being overprotective of the person with psychosis, smothering them with kindness, doing everything for them. So that's one pole of expressed emotion. The other pole is the style that's trying to energize them. It's pushing too hard. It's trying to get the loved one up and running, and it is perceived as being too much. That's the other pole of expressed emotion. Now, this can be subtle. There can be a subtle over kindness or a subtle but definite push towards more activities. We need to move into a neutral stance early on so that the pressure is taken off. Moving the car gear stick into neutral can feel like a step backwards. It can feel like we're doing nothing, but in actual fact, we're moving into neutral so that we can get communication sorted out, and then recovery will come on its own. It's like if we can set the ground rules for recovery, recovery will start slowly in the background. There is a natural tendency for recovery in schizophrenia and the other psychoses. So if you talk about talking, we've by now hopefully befriended ourselves a bit. We're doing a bit of befriending with our loved one. We've moved the emotional tone into neutrality. And now we can start to move beyond that to care a bit more about the loved one in terms of the psychosis by showing interest or curiosity. Now, curiosity is the key word. You tell me that the mafia are in our area and they're trying to kill you. I mean, that sounds really scary. How can I learn more about this? So we can do a bit of talking and say, it's scary. I acknowledge the emotion there, and I would love to understand more about what you're saying. Now, we're not colluding with it. We're saying, I just want to understand where this came from. So that's a gentle exploration, and it's collaborative. So you would go back to the loved one and say, I've investigated what you said about the mafia, and I can't find much in the newspaper this week about it. There is a couple of references to various things going on in the world, but no actual talk of mafia. Could you have a look at the paper with me and tell me if it's in one of these other articles somewhere? So it's a very gentle exploration. Remember, we're not confronting and we're not colluding. We're just trying to find out. This is a collaborative style which allows the recovery process to start. We can ask factual questions. Well, you're telling me about the mafia. Can you tell me, is it Italian or Russian, or what kind of mafia are you talking about here? Now, this is a question just of fact. It's asking the person to give you another bit of information. And very often people with delusions find that interesting to talk in that way, because they're not being fully rejected, that they're understanding that you want to know more about what you're going through. Could you look at this together? Could you keep a diary together? Now, writing things down about the psychosis and about the gradual move to recovery is very, very helpful. The more that you write in a diary, say a page a day, if your loved one could do that, and you could put a note on the bottom about what's been happening that day and about what feelings there's been. If it's anxiety about that kind of belief, can we score the anxiety? Could you like score it at 70% of maximal one day, 50% the next day? Does it fluctuate? I wonder why it would fluctuate from day to day. So it's very, very good to write things, and it's very good to score things. That is always something we would be doing in cognitive behavioral therapy. Can we model these kind of CBT ideas of investigating and finding out a bit more about this? So if the loved one sees us bringing the newspaper in to look for information, maybe they could go online or visit a library to try and gather some more information. These kind of paranoid beliefs struggle to survive in the face of evidence that's being gathered in a collaborative way. Could we do something to reduce the anxiety? So the person I'm talking about had a lot of anxiety about persecution. Now, obviously, there's lots of ways to reduce anxiety. And if we can identify our loved one's key emotion, anything that we can do to reduce that negative emotion is helpful. There is an old study which showed that relaxation training helped hallucinations because it took the anxiety out of them. And a lot of the loved ones will have anxiety as part of the problem. So there's lots of things we can do that might help. We'll come to this in a later video. We do need to be aware of red flags. Now, red flags mean things we need to be thinking about. Is this something that I need to get help with fairly urgently? So if a loved one all of a sudden comes to believe that you're in the mafia, I mean, that's quite a big change, isn't it? And if that happened, I would want to take advice from whoever is the mental health professional, be it a psychiatrist, psychiatric social worker, whoever is your key link person. I would really want to get some help because that's a change, isn't it? Or if your loved one seems to be becoming very depressed, we probably need to ask, are you having thoughts about hurting yourself? And usually a loved one will be fairly honest about that. Not always, but usually they will be. And that can again allow you to make the call you need to. Or if you've said to them, I can see you're very frightened. Have you taken the steps of getting yourself a weapon of any kind? And if they say yes, then again, that is something that you would want to get fairly prompt help about, to have that flagged up in the system and to get the input you need to make the whole thing safe. So we need to know about red flags and how to act in that situation. So obviously, NAMI in Marin County is the sponsors of this workshop today. We've mentioned Amador's LEAP training, which is a great starting point. There's a variety of family therapy treatment options around the world, and open dialogue was an approach that originally came from Scandinavia, in which very open communication between the loved one, the family, the school, the workplace is absolutely fundamental for recovery, and open dialogue has good results. Early intervention in psychosis will often have a family therapy component there, but it must be said over the years, family therapy, family supports have probably been the least developed area of services around the world. What about normalizing? Well, these kind of approaches say that we're all of us on the same spectrum, and that any of us can move from our current position towards a more psychotic end of the human experience. So, paranoid thoughts are incredibly common. How often have we gone into work and thought, they're all talking about me? Because all of a sudden, when you go in, they all go quiet. Now, usually you investigate this and it's not true. It's not the fact. They weren't actually talking about you. But that's a paranoid thought. And that thought is moving along the spectrum towards paranoia. Sleep deprivation. Anybody who's sleep deprived can hear and see things that aren't there. It's a very strong link. And what we can be saying is the tired mind plays tricks on us. Most of us have had episodes like that where we've misperceived something because we're just so tired. So that kind of discussion can be useful. The first one says, let's reduce your stress levels a wee bit. And the second one says, is there anything we can do to improve your sleep at night time? Maybe these things might help. Now, we know that in our loved ones with schizophrenia, psychosis, stress and sleep deprivation are almost always in the mix. So the normalizing explanation makes some sense of why they're experiencing this, and it also gives you a possible action to reduce stress or improve sleep. Grief. Anyone who hasn't grieved properly can hallucinate the presence of their lost loved one. And this is often hearing them speak, and it can often be feeling a touch or their presence. So there's a link between failure to grieve and hallucination. Again, this is a normalizing explanation, and it gives a route to do something about it. Anyone who has been through a trauma and who hasn't dealt with that trauma can experience voices and visions. And this, of course, is very common in our military returning from theatres of war where there's been extreme trauma and they haven't been able to process it. It's overwhelmed the brain. So it can be described in people who have been through that kind of trauma as a kind of PTSD-like experience. And again, this is an explanation which reduces stigma and gives a way forward. Maybe we should have some therapy to work with that trauma. And there are a variety of expert therapies available. Then there's drugs. Anyone who takes a lot of LSD can get visual hallucinations, which can last a long time. So drugs can cause this. And what about taking very strong cannabis in high doses every day? Well, that can cause paranoia, it can cause reduced motivation and reduced concentration and memory. Now, if we can stop taking the LSD or the cannabis, that is the beginnings of a recovery trajectory. It's also an explanation, which sometimes people who are using cannabis and they're paranoid have never quite made that link. Now, loved ones who have recovered from psychosis say that one of the things that helped them was when something positive could be seen in the schizophrenia psychosis. So maybe it's important to look for that. There's certainly a genetic closeness between schizophrenia and genius. And Albert Einstein's a great example of that particular genetic closeness. People with schizophrenia can have very impressive talents in painting, music, poetry, and writing. But sometimes it's been held back by the psychosis. And if we can find that and give the person a lot of support and positive feedback to nurture that creativity that often exists alongside schizophrenia psychosis, that can be a big help towards recovery. We can mention famous people who have heard voices, people held in high esteem by society who have had delusions or voices and yet been a huge success. There is also this issue of spiritual sensitivity in psychosis, and this again can be seen as a positive aspect of it. So it's quite important that we don't view this illness as being totally negative. To get through to recovery, sometimes seeing that little positive bit of it can be very, very helpful. And of course, that can feed through into coping strategies and all the other important elements of recovery. We should talk about times that we've struggled. We should mention that because our loved one is struggling and feeling bad about themselves, feeling low in confidence. And to hear that mum or dad at one time went through a tough time where they struggled with sadness or anxiety and how they came through it is very, very helpful at times. It can show that you can be resilient, you can get through these times. We can talk about setbacks. We can also talk about times which we're lucky and we were in the right place at the right time and got an option to develop our career. We can say, what do I need help with right now? We can say to our loved one with psychosis, I'm working a lot just now. I'm not getting an ideal sleep. I'm feeling kind of tired and drained. What do you think? I mean, you know me well. What do you think I could be doing to get through this difficult patch? Might be interesting and certainly empowering to hear what they might say. It's good to mention things that you've tried to do and maybe didn't succeed at. So we're modeling acceptance of some bits of our life not being a big success. And it's reasonable to say that you've had some strange experiences too. Maybe that night that you thought you'd seen a ghost or whatever. It's good to mention things like that. Now we come to culture, and culture is a very important aspect of the causation of schizophrenia psychosis and also of recovery. So cultural support is strongly protective against developing psychosis. There is clear research that the further you move away from cultural support into a new and different culture, the more likely you are to develop psychosis. Now, this is a factor for thinking about people who have migrated, who have been an asylum seeker, or whose cultural roots are, in fact, elsewhere in the world. That being seen, that re-embedding your loved one in their culture can be helpful. And that might involve thinking about the family history, thinking about the typical food of that culture. I had one young man who started reading an Armenian newspaper again to get back into his cultural background. And it was helpful for him. Be aware of the conflicts between your root culture and your new culture, and because we need to be aware of how to resolve them. And in some cultures, stigma is incredibly high. And so we need to be aware of that. And loss of face around mental disorder are something that really holds you back from recovery. So we need to be aware of not only the positive sides of culture, but also some of the negative sides, and take appropriate means of dealing with those negative aspects of culture. It must be said that a therapist, if you're going to have a therapist involved from the same culture, will often have better results than a therapist from a different culture. But we should be training all mental health professionals in cultural aspects of schizophrenia psychosis. So we're now going to have a question and answer session. And before we do that, I would like you to do one of these two exercises. We mentioned about befriending yourself. This can be a great first step. So try and catch those negative automatic thoughts. Just think back to the last time you made a mistake or something didn't go too well. What were your thoughts at that time? Were they self-nurturing? If not, then let's think about that episode and record some self-nurturing thoughts and play them back on the cell phone. Or if your loved one is contactable at the current time, ask about your key communication style and say that you want absolute honesty. Can they think about 4 keywords for how you come across, and what feelings do they have about that interaction?